Yes, I will be talking in English since that is I feel more comfortable with. But in this talk, I will seek for causes for long periods of sustaining the societal peace in national park management in Finland. The causes are searched from the Sami opinions and the management preferences, their inclusivity and functioning. My source material is gathered from various sources during my earlier studies on environmental history of Inari. And these glimpses of local opinions are studied in administrative and historical context in charting why was the park management so long so non-conflictual. Inari is a multi-ethnic municipality. It's a home area for Finns and all three Sami groups residing in Finland, consisting of Northern Skolt and the Anar Sami. The southern parts of Inari belong to the subarctic boreal zone and have been logged quite extensively, while the northern parts are transition zones from towards tundra vegetation zone. And the ecosystem which is protected in Inari are the old forests. The land, which is already almost totally under numerous protection and utilization regimes, is owned by the state, even though this is disputed from the 1960s onwards by the Sami movement. Inari is known for a long series of recurring disputes and conflicts over land use from the 1980s onwards. And these disputes have concentrated on the relation between forestry and reindeer herding, which utilize same lands, where the clearest divisions go between nature conservationists and environmentalists from the south, and the State Forest and Park Service, what is called in what follows FPS, an organ responsible for the loggings in Inari. The Sami front is not unified, as there have been Sami loggers in the payroll of the FPS. The herder community does not necessarily share the indigenous rights discourse in a similar depth than those Sami involved in the ethnopolitics. And until recently, the disputes were non-existent in the numerous nature conservation projects in the municipality, which I will discuss after a short look over the ways the Sami have disputed the establishment and administration of the nature parks in Norway. Here, among Sami, nature protection is easily taken as an intrusion to the Sami domicile, as a violation to the right to live off the land and enjoy the benefits stream it provides. Nature protection also is taken as a means of bypassing the existing administrative boards and conflict management systems by establishing a new nature protection regime, which shifts the protection of biodiversity away from the conservation by responsible users and transfers the jurisdiction from local domain control to central domain control. Nature protection also proposes a wrong preference from the Sami point of view. Nature protection is given priority over traditional uses. In the Sami perception, the undisturbed natural landscapes are prioritized without acknowledgement that these are long-used Sami cultural landscapes, and that many of the areas selected for parks are core areas for Sami reindeer herding. Cultural heritage monuments receive explicit recognition, but there is little focus on contemporary Sami reindeer management and living culture. Sami protest also the wide-scale commercial usage plans outside and within the parks, disturbing reindeer herding, plus the undemocratic integration of the herders in administrations. These questions of rights violations raised by the Sami have been echoed also by other indigenous peoples across the globe on the experiences of conservation as exclusion of the indigenes from their native lands. And from the point of view of principle, these are legitimate claims, but from a pragmatic point of view, they have contributed to the high conflict level. My cases are two national parks from a quite long time back in history. In short, the Sami opinions were very positive towards the establishment of these parks. The Sami herders took these parks as zones for protection of reindeer herding. And this shows how the Sami framed these questions from an economical point of view. And the question was not formulated as a preach against the Sami rights, but as reserves for the grazing reindeer. And when it comes to the political context and the Sami movement of the time, especially in the 1950s, back then there was a very low will to challenge the state officials, especially as they were offering protection of the Sami means of living from another state actor, the FPS and the loggings. Jan-Åke Riiset has claimed that the nature protection is complex matter, but at this point of time it was not. In the Finnish establishment projects of the parks, there was no dispossession, no marginalization of the Sami and their means of living, but immediate inclusion of the reindeer herding to the park and conservation plans, including the cultural heritage connected to herding. There is only one example of forbidding reindeer herding from the protected areas in Lapland, and that is the Malla Nature Reserve. But in the Finnish cases, both the lived space of the Sami and the resource of reindeer herding is and are protected. The administrative shows following preferences. They actively and very effectively limit the commercial use of the area, including the tourist industry. And they show a high preference of ecological values and protection thereof. And they show, to a lesser extent, commercial double standards, which the Norwegian system is being accused of. Sure enough, they show quite low preference of the traditional knowledge. The parks are delimited by scientific and ecological knowledge. And as such, they do not qualify as exclusory fortress nature reserves, nor as reserves with shared responsibility to protect the rangelands and wildlife, but zones of shared access and protection from more harmful land use forms. Shortly about the local preferences. Also, the locals favor protection as long as they don't impede the usage rights, such as hunting, fishing, and snaring. And even nature protection is a strong state discourse in Finland, but it is not shared only by the administrative elite. It is also shared by the local people, if not taken as excessive conservation as it is formulated. There is widespread anti-exploitative forestry opinion and resistance of tapping of the resources to the south. One informant to Italian English anthropologist formulated this, that they do not like that people in south produce toilet paper of the old forests up north. So there is a consensus in the midst of ongoing conflicts in park administration in Inari. There are several reasons to this. So The unofficial Sami land regimes or conflict management instances were not bypassed or marginalized, but the strongest land regime, FPS, was. There was non-exclusion of reindeer herding. The Sami herders gained land use rights, cultural rights, and almost undisturbed herding. So they find themselves in a win-win situation with the park administration. And in such issues, there is no need to raise issues of trust, even if it would have been a scarcity. And what also has to be said is that the issue of Sami rights was not topical as such, and that means that the issue that also is one factor raising the conflict levels, absence of right claims, which are considered unfair and undemocratic by other parties, were not heard or overruled in the later debates and discussions. It is not only Finnish researchers who mean that this has been a success. Also, the mentioned Italian English anthropologist Nuccio Mazzulla has considered the Finnish environmental protection agenda as not as devastating as the more dramatic examples of nature conservation around the world could be. The democratic processes as they have allowed for both industrial development, environmental protection, and the safeguarding of local traditions, despite some strong internal resistance on the part of the certain economic and political interest groups surfacing on later date. And indeed, lately there have been a new surge of forestry conflicts which also concern the nature conservation. And this took place in the early or mid-2000s. And its background is that there was an increase in demand of pulp, while at the same time debates have been affected by increase of in environmental and ethnopolitical awareness among various interest groups. And there is also a new actor in play, the EU, which dictates, according to local opinion, the nature protection in a disturbing manner. So has also conservation paradigms have been changed, according to which equity and usage rights and indigenous peoples' rights are to be taken more seriously. These new guidelines or missions, they highlight both biodiversity, sustainable use, and recognition of indigenous peoples' rights to their lands and territories. In Finland, in the case of Finland, this has and potentially will open new ways to question the Sami presence and the Sami performance in these protected areas. So biodiversity is not necessarily a democratic regime of thought, rather the opposite, and has given tools to question the Sami environmental performance in the protected areas. The inclusion of land ownership issues opens up debates of to whom the rights would apply for, and this there is an ongoing fierce debate in Inari and Lapland on who gets to be a Sami according to the international treaties of indigenous peoples' rights. This debate is expected to expand on the nature conservation debates as well, if they are allowed to do that. So, in conclusion, conservation has become more complex, and there has been a democratic turn which caters for that complexity. But the Finnish research on the recent forestry debates proposes that a possible solution, that the inclusion of the local and translocal actors in the planning negotiations usually caters for compromises. These discussions can be undertaken in both official, but more preferably also in an unofficial platforms. What has not changed is that the locals they prefer and they prioritize highly their usage rights to hunting, fishing, and snaring. And any rumors of restricting these rights will cause a rupture in pro-protection sentiments and claims of southern actors and southern intrusion. And given the new heights of tension concerning the claims to Sami identity and Sami ethnicity, this might still be the only point of agreement locally. Thank you very much.